Set. Every great civilization eventually disappears. Its language dies. Its religion is forgotten. Its cities are buried under centuries of sand and silence. That is the rule of history, and it is nearly universal. Iran broke the rule. Over the last 2,500 years, the land and people we now call Iran have been conquered by Greeks, Arabs, Turks, and Mongols. They have seen their capitals burned, their libraries destroyed, and their ruling dynasties erased entirely, some of them more than once. And yet, the Persian language survived every invasion. The poetry of Rumi and Hales, written under foreign occupation, became the literary inheritance of the entire Islamic world. A civilization that should have been absorbed and forgotten instead absorbed its conquerors, turning their religions, their languages, and their cultures into something distinctly, defiantly Iranian. How does a civilization do that? How does it bend without breaking again and again across more than 24 centuries? That is the central mystery at the heart of this documentary. In the chapters that follow, we will trace the full arc of Iranian history, the glory and the catastrophe, the empires and the revolutions, the poets and the kings, to uncover what makes this civilization one of the most resilient and most misunderstood in the history of the world. Long before emperors marched their armies across the ancient world, long before the name Persia stirred fear or wonder in distant lands, there was the land itself. The Iranian plateau rises from the earth like a fortress built by nature. Ringed by the Zagros Mountains to the west, the Albers Range sweeping along the north, and vast salt deserts stretching across its interior. This elevated heartland sits roughly 1 million square miles of mountain, steppe, and arid plain. It is a land of extremes. Winters bite hard in the mountain passes. Summers baked the central lowlands into cracked, pale earth. And yet, along the river valleys and mountain foothills, where water found its way, life took hold with remarkable tenacity. This geography was never merely backdrop, it was destiny. The plateau sat at the very crossroads of the ancient world, connecting Mesopotamia to the west, with Central Asia to the east, and the Indian subcontinent beyond. Any civilization rising here would absorb, resist, and ultimately shape the great currents of human history flowing around it. The earliest permanent settlements appeared thousands of years before the Common Era in the fertile lands near what is today the southwestern region of Iran. Here in the shadow of the Zagros Mountains arose one of history's most overlooked civilizations, Aleom. By around 3000 BCE, the Alamites had built a sophisticated society centered on the city of Susa, a metropolis of temples, administrative buildings, and bustling trade networks. Their script, their art, and their political institutions placed them firmly among the great civilizations of the ancient Near East, contemporaries and rivals of Sumer and Babylon. Susa itself would endure for millennia, changing hands and identities, outlasting empires that believed themselves eternal. Then, beginning around 1500 BC and continuing for several centuries, something transformative began. From the steppes of Central Asia, waves of semi-nomadic peoples began moving southward and westward onto the Iranian plateau. These were the Indo-Aryan peoples, sometimes called Aryans, a word meaning noble in their own ancient tongue. They brought horses, distinctive pottery, and a reverence for fire that would eventually evolve into one of the world's oldest living religions. Gradually, two major groups settled and consolidated. The Mess established themselves in the northwestern regions in the cooler highlands near modern-day Hamadan. The Persians drifted further south and east, settling eventually in a region they would call Parsa, known to the Greeks as Perseus. For centuries, these groups remained tribal confederations organized around kinship and cattle, largely overshadowed by the thundering empires of Assyria and Babylon pressing in from the west. They were to outside observers peripheral peoples of little consequence, but the plateau had a long memory, and the mountains had a habit of producing extraordinary things. For generations, the Mess had lived as scattered highland clans, paying tribute to Assyrian overlords who viewed them as little more than a source of horses and conscript soldiers. But around 700 BCE, something shifted in the mountain kingdoms of the northwest. A chieftain named Doyas, described by the Greek historian Herodotus as brilliant and calculating, understood that survival required unity. He built a reputation as a supremely fair judge, arbitrating disputes between quarreling tribes with such skill that his fame spread across the highlands. Then, in a move of breathtaking political theater, he withdrew his services entirely. As the tribes fell back into chaos, They did the only thing that seemed logical. They made Dios as their king. His first act was to build a capital worthy of that ambition. Epatana, situated in the cool highlands, near what is today the city of Hamadan, rose from the earth as a monument to Median power. Ancient sources described it in almost mythological terms. A city of concentric walls, each ring painted a different color, the innermost gleaming with silver and gold. Whether the legends match the reality matters less than what Ecbatana represented, a permanent center of gravity around which a people could organize themselves as something more than a collection of tribes. But it was Dios's grandsons who transformed the Median kingdom into a true military empire. Saxorai was a modernizer. He reorganized his army along professional lines, separating units by weapon type, creating distinct divisions of spearmen, cavalry, and archers. It was a reform that made the mess genuinely dangerous on an open battlefield. His opportunity came from an unexpected direction. The Assyrian Empire, the most feared military machine the ancient world had yet produced, was cracking under the pressure of constant revolt and internal succession struggles. Queso recognized that even great empires die when they exhaust themselves. He forged an alliance with Mar-Palisar of Babylon, cementing it through the marriage of his granddaughter to the Babylonian prince Nebuchadnezzar. Together, they turned on Assyria with devastating coordination. In 612 BCE, their combined armies descended on Nineveh, the Assyrian capital that the prophet Nan had called the City of Blood. After a siege that lasted months, the walls fell. Nineveh was burned to its foundations. The Assyrian Empire, which had terrorized the ancient Near East for centuries, simply ceased to exist. The ancient world had witnessed nothing quite like it. The mess claimed the northern and eastern portions of the former Assyrian domains, extending their reach from Anatolia in the west to the borders of Central Asia in the east under the last great Median king. Ages this empire reached its territorial peak. It was vast, wealthy, and apparently unassailable. And yet, within the empire's own borders in the southern province of Para, a Persian prince was growing up in the Median court, watching everything. That Persian prince had a name, Cyrus, second of that name. Born of the Achaemenid clan, raised partly in the shadow of his Median grandfather's court, he had watched Astyages rule. He had learned what power looked like from the inside and what its weaknesses were. Around 559 BCE, Cyrus became king of Anon, a Persian sub-kingdom within the Median sphere. For a time he paid his tribute, kept his head down, and waited. Then he stopped waiting. The revolt against began around 550 BCE, and what followed was less a bloody war than a collapse. Median commanders, deeply resentful of Ages, defected to Cyrus mid-campaign. The Median army dissolved where it stood. Agassiz was captured alive, reportedly treated with mercy, and the great fortified capital of Ecbatana simply changed hands. The Median Empire did not fall on fire. It fell in silence from within. Cyrus absorbed rather than destroyed. Median nobles retained their positions. Median customs and court protocols continued. He understood something that most conquerors never grasped, that the machinery of empire is more valuable than the satisfaction of demolishing it. His next target was Croesus, the fabulously wealthy king of Lydia in western Anatolia. Croesus had famously consulted the oracle at Delhi before marching east, receiving the prophecy that if he crossed the river Helis, he would destroy a great empire. He crossed the river. He did destroy a great empire, his own. The two armies clashed near Sardis around 547 BCE. Crowley retreated. Believing the campaign season was over, Cyrus pressed forward through winter, surrounded the Lydian capital, and took it within weeks. The man who had been the richest king in the known world was now a captive. Lydia fell. But what came next would define Cyrus's legacy for 3,000 years. In 539 BCE, Cyrus turned south and east toward Babylon, the greatest city on earth, a metropolis of perhaps 200,000 souls ringed by walls so massive that the Greek historian Herodotus claimed 2 4-horse chariots could pass each other on top of them. The city seemed impregnable. It surrendered almost without a fight. Babylonian priests and merchants is enchanted with their own King Nandis opened the gates. Cyrus entered not as a conqueror, but as a liberator grasping the hands of Marduk's statue in the ancient ritual of legitimate kingship. The city celebrated. Then came the act that echoes loudest across history. Cyrus issued a decree recorded on a small clay barrel, now known as the Cyrus Islander, that recognized the religious traditions of all peoples within his empire, permitted deporters to return to their homelands, and explicitly repudiated the Assyrian and Babylonian practice of mass forced resettlement. The Jews of Babylon, exiled for decades by Nebuchadnezzar, were free to return to Jerusalem. The Hebrew Bible records Cyrus's name with a reverence reserved for almost no foreign ruler. Isaiah calls him a shepherd, a Messiah. Scholars debate how much of this tolerance was genuine philosophy and how much was brilliant political calculation. Perhaps it was both. An empire stretching from the Aegean coast to the edges of Central Asia could not be governed through brute terror alone. It required legitimacy in the eyes of dozens of peoples, languages, and gods. Cyrus gave them that legitimacy, and they gave him in return compliance. His empire was by that point the largest the world had ever seen. Nothing in human history had yet reached its scale. He died around 530 BC on campaign in the eastern steppes, fighting nomadic tribes along the Central Asian frontier, the ungovernable edges where every great empire eventually bleeds out. His body was brought back to Passage, where a simple stone tomb still stands today. A traveler, in antiquity, reported an inscription carved above the entrance. "I am Cyrus, King of Kings. Do not begrudge me this small monument." Cyrus left behind the largest empire the world had ever seen. He also left behind the question every empire must eventually answer. Who comes next? His son Cambyses II inherited the throne and pushed the Persian frontier further still, conquering Egypt in 525 BCE and adding the ancient kingdom of the Nile to the Achaemenid realm. But Cambyses died in mysterious circumstances in 522 BCE, returning from campaign, leaving no clear heir. What followed was a crisis that could have unraveled everything his father built. Into that vacuum stepped a man named Gamata, a Magi's, who claimed to be Smerdis, the brother of Cambyses, whom Cambyses had secretly murdered years earlier. Whether Gata genuinely believed his claim or was a deliberate impostor, history has never fully settled. What is certain is that a Persian nobleman of royal Anded blood, a young military commander named Darius, decided the man on the throne was a fraud. Along with 6 co-conspirators, Darius moved swiftly. They found Galata killed him, and Darius seized the throne. It was by any honest account a coup. The new king understood immediately that legitimacy was his most urgent problem. How do you convince an empire of millions that your seizure of power was righteous? You write it in stone 600 feet above the ground in 3 languages, where no enemy can reach it, and every traveler must look up. The Behistun inscription carved into a sheer cliff face along the main road between Babylon and Ecbatana is one of history's most extraordinary acts of political propaganda. Darius had craftsmen chisel his version of events across a vast rock face in old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. He is depicted in relief, his foot resting on the fallen Gal Mata, while defeated rebel leaders stand bound before him. The gods, the text insists, gave him this victory. The lie, if it was one, was literally carved into the mountain. That same inscription would become 20 years later the key that unlocked the uniform writing system entirely, when the British officer Henry Rawlinson painstakingly copied the text in the 1830s and 40s. Its trilingual nature allowed scholars to finally decode ancient Mesopotamian languages. Darius's propaganda became an archaeological Rosetta Stone, but Darius was far more than a propagandist. Once the throne was secured, he turned his formidable energy towards something no Persian ruler had yet attempted, systematically organizing the machinery of empire. He divided the realm into roughly 20 administrative units, called satraps, each governed by a satrap, a trusted official who collected taxes, maintained order, and answered directly to the king. Crucially, military commanders and financial inspectors in each region reported independently to the crown, creating overlapping chains of accountability that checked any single satrap's power. Darius understood bureaucracy the way Cyrus had understood conquest. Binding these provinces together was the Royal Road, a highway stretching nearly 1,700 meters from Sardis on the Aegean coast to Susa in the Persian heartland. Royal couriers riding in relays could cover this distance in roughly 7 days, a speed of communication that the ancient world found almost miraculous. Herodotus marveled at them. Neither snow nor rain, nor heat, nor darkness stops these couriers. Those words would one day be inscribed on a post office in New York. To unify commerce across this vast territory, Darius introduced a deric, a gold coin bearing the king's image, along with standardized weights and measures. For the first time, a merchant in Anatolia and a merchant in Bactria could conduct business in a shared language of value. And then there was Pepololis. Beginning around 518 BCE, Darius initiated construction of a ceremonial capital on a great elevated platform in the far region, the Persian homeland. Tens of thousands of workers paid wages that administrative tablets still record. Raised, towering columned halls decorated with carved delegations from every corner of the empire, an image of unity rendered in stone. The empire Darius had so carefully constructed was about to collide with a world it had never fully reckoned with. Along the western edge of the Aeonid realm, on the Aeon coast of what is now Turkey, lay a scattering of Greekine cities known as Ionia. These cities had been absorbed into Persian control for decades, governed by local tyrants who answered to the satraps. For most Ionians, Persian rule was tolerable, if not beloved. But in 499 BCE, simmering resentment boiled over into open revolt. The rebellion began in Miletus, led by a man named Aristogaras, who had the ambition of a king and the luck of a gambler. He appealed for help to the Greek mainland, and while Sparta declined, Athens sent 20 ships. It was a modest contribution, but a fateful one. When the rebels marched inland and burned the regional capital of Sardis, Darius received the news with cold fury. An attendant was said to remind the king of Athens 3 times each day, so that he would not forget who had humiliated him. The Ionian revolt was crushed by 494 BCE, militated him. The Ionian revolt was crushed by 494 BCE him, but Darius had made his decision. The Greeks would answer for Sardis. His first expedition faltered when the Persian fleet was wrecked in a storm off the coast of Mount Aues in 492 BCE. He sent a second force 2 years later, roughly 25,000 men, crossing the Aenae and by ship under the generals Datus and Artaphans. The island hopped across the sea, burning Eratria, and then landed on the plain of Marathon 26 miles northeast of Athens. What happened there in 490 BC has echoed through Western civilization ever since. A Greek force, smaller but fighting on ground of its own choosing, attacked the Persian line at a run. The Athenian hoplites, armored and disciplined, folded the Persian flanks inward and drove them back to their ships. Persia lost thousands of men. Athens lost fewer than 200. A messenger, the legend says, ran the entire distance to Athens to announce the victory before collapsing dead. The marathon race carries his name to this day. Darius died in 486 BCE before he could launch his revenge. That task fell to his son Xerxes, who conceived something on an entirely different scale. He assembled the largest invasion force the ancient world had ever attempted. Perhaps 200,000 soldiers by cautious estimates, and bridged the Hellespont with a double line of boats to walk them into Europe. The Greeks, fractious and divided, had perhaps 40,000 defenders in total. At the mountain pass of Thermopylae in 480 BCE, 300 Spartans under King Leonidas and several thousand allies held the Persian army for 3 days before a Greek traitor revealed a path around the pass. The Spartans died where they stood. Xerxes marched to Athens and burned the Acropolis, but the sea would undo him. In the narrow Strait of Salam, the Greek admiral Theistic lured the Persian fleet into waters too cramped for its size. The Greeks crushed them. Xerxes watched from a golden throne on the shore. The following year at Plataea, 479 BCE, Greek land forces destroyed what remained of the Persian army. Persia never invaded Greece again. The long decades of conflict wound to a formal close with the Peace of Calais around 449 BCE. Acknowledging the boundaries neither side could breach, the wars left both civilizations forever changed. Greece emerged with a soaring confidence that would fuel its golden age. Persia had not been destroyed, only stopped. The empire remained vast and powerful. But a new question had entered the world. If Persia could not conquer Greece, what else might resist it? The wars with Greece had not broken the Achaemenid Empire. They had, however, revealed something unsettling about its interior. While Xerxes marched and fought, the palace at Pippolis had grown into a world of its own, dense with ceremony, rivalry, and whispered ambition. In 465 BCE, Xerxes was murdered in his bedchamber. The assassin was Artabanes, the commander of the royal guard, a man trusted absolutely and therefore dangerous beyond measure. Within months, Artabanes himself was killed by Artaxerxes I, the son who emerged from the chaos to claim the throne. It was a pattern that would repeat with grim regularity across the empire's final century. What is often overlooked in accounts of this period is how much power flowed through the women of the royal court. Figures like a mistress, the wife of Xerxes, and later Perisate, mother of Artaxerxes, Xerxes II, wielded genuine political influence. They managed alliances, settled scores, and shaped succession. Persian royal women held property, commanded households, and appear in the administrative tablets from Peopolus, receiving rations and issuing orders. These were not figures ornamental to power. In many cases, they were its architects. By the 400s BCE, the empire's vast provincial structure had become both its strength and its vulnerability. The satraps, governors of territories stretching from Egypt to Central Asia, controlled enormous wealth and private armies. When central authority weakened, the temptation to act independently proved irresistible. The great satraps' revolt of the 360s and 350s BCE saw multiple governors simultaneously defying the crown, coordinating rebellions across Asia Minor and Egypt. The empire wobbled, but did not fall, held together partly by the Katapai's own inability to unite under a single alternative. Through all of this turbulence, Zoroastrianism provided something the political order could not: a stable spiritual foundation for Persian identity. The faith of the prophet Zarathustra proclaimed a universe locked in struggle between Ahura Mazda, the wise lord of truth and light, and angry Manu, the destructive spirit of darkness and lies. Persian kings had long framed their rule in this cosmic language, casting themselves as agents of order against chaos. By the 4th century BCE, fire temples burned across the empire. Priests called magi maintained sacred rites, and the faith had woven itself so deeply into Persian culture that it would survive even the empire's eventual destruction. The one figure who briefly reversed the decline was Artaxerxes III, who came to power in 358 BCE with a ruthlessness that impressed even his enemies. He reconquered Egypt in 343 BC. He suppressed the satrapal revolts and briefly made the empire feel whole again. Then he was poisoned in 338 BC ECE, almost certainly by his vizier. The throne passed through 2 more kings in as many years into that vacuum from the cold mountains of Macedonia. A young general was already looking east. He was 22 years old when he crossed the age pond in 334 BCE, leading an army of perhaps 40,000 men into the heart of the world's largest empire. Alexander of Macedon had absorbed the lessons of his tutor Aristotle and the battlefield genius of his father Philip II, and he had come not merely to raid, but to conquer everything. The Persian resistance collapsed with startling speed. 2 early victories in Asia Minor opened the western provinces, and by 3333 BC, at the Battle of Ish in southern Anatolia, Alexander met the Persian King Darius III in person, and routed him so completely that Darius fled the field, leaving behind his mother, his wife, and his daughters as prisoners. Alexander, to his credit, treated them with conspicuous respect. It was a gesture that spoke as much to political calculation as to personal honor. The decisive blow came in 331 BCE at Gaugamela, on the dusty plains of what is now northern, then Iraq. Darius had chosen the ground, carefully leveling the terrain to maximize the effectiveness of his war chariots. It was not enough. Alexander's oblique cavalry charge tore open the Persian line, and Darius, facing encirclement, fled a second time. The Achaemenid Empire, that extraordinary structure built by Cyrus and Darius the Great across 2 centuries, effectively ceased to exist in a single afternoon. Babylon surrendered. Susa surrendered. Then came Persepolis. The burning of the great ceremonial capital in 330 BCE remains one of antiquity's most debated acts of destruction. Ancient sources offer conflicting accounts. One tradition holds that Alexander torched the palaces in deliberate revenge for the Persian burning of Athens 150 years earlier, a symbolic settling of accounts. Another suggests the fire began during a drunken banquet, perhaps at the urging of an Athenian courtice named Tai, and spread beyond anyone's intention. The truth is probably irretrievable. What is certain is that the magnificent stone terraces, the painted columns, the treasury containing the wealth of generations, all were consumed. Travelers would find the ruins blackened for centuries afterward. Yet even as he destroyed, Alexander was transforming himself. He adopted Persian courtiers, incorporated Iranian nobles into his administration, and demanded the proskynesis, the prostration ritual of Persian royal protocol, from his own Macedonian officers. They were appalled. To Greeks, bowing before a living man was a gesture reserved for gods. The tensions nearly broke his army from within. In 327 BCE, Alexander married Roxana, a Bactrian princess from what is now Afghanistan, and encouraged his officers to take Persian wives. He was not merely conquering the Iran. He was attempting to become its king in the truest sense, fusing two civilizations into something unprecedented. He never founded the project in 323 BCE in Babylon. Alexander died of fever at the age of 32. He left no clear successor, and within hours of his death, the argument over his empire had begun. His generals, the Diadechi, the successors, spent 40 years tearing the conquests apart. Iran eventually fell to Seleucus, who founded a dynasty bearing his name. Greek cities rose across the plateau. Greek became the language of administration, and Hellen culture pressed deep into Asian soil. But beneath the marble columns and the Greek inscriptions, something older persisted. The Persian language endured in villages and valleys. Zoroastrian fire temples continued to burn. Local customs, land tenure patterns, and administrative traditions quietly carried forward the Achaemenid inheritance. Conquerors could rename the cities. They could not so easily rename the people, and from the eastern reaches of the former empire, a new Iranian dynasty was already beginning to stir. Seleucus had been one of Alexander's most capable commanders, a general who had survived the chaos of the Diadechi wars through patience, calculation, and a ruthlessness he rarely advertised. By 312 BCE, he had secured Babylon, and from that foundation he reached eastward, reasserting control over the Iranian plateau, with an army that combined Macedonian discipline with the organizational memory of the empire he had inherited. The Susid dynasty had arrived. What followed was something genuinely novel. The Susids did not simply occupy Iran. They attempted to reshape it. Greek colonists arrived in organized waves, and new cities rose across ancient soil bearing names that would have sounded impossibly foreign to Achaemenid ears. Susha on the Tigris grew into one of the ancient world's great urban centers, its population eventually rivaling Alexandria itself. Along the plateau's trade routes, dozens of smaller settlements carried Greek names, Greek architecture, and Greek civic institutions. The gymnasium, that quintessential symbol of Hellenic culture, appeared in cities where a generation earlier Zoroastrian priests had performed their rites undisturbed. The administrative language shifted to Greek. Coins bore Greek inscriptions. Royal correspondence flowed in a tongue that most Iranians had never heard before. Alexander's cavalry appeared on their horizon. And yet, was any of this truly transforming the people themselves? Walk beyond the city walls, and a different world persisted with remarkable stubbornness. In the agricultural villages that fed those gleaming new cities, Iranian dialects continued as the natural language of daily life. Zoroastrian fire temples maintained their sacred flames, tended by priests who traced their lineage and their liturgical knowledge back through generations. The Greeks had never touched. Local dynasts in peripheral regions, men who had served the Achaemenids in administrative roles, quietly continued governing their territories under a thin veneer of holistic loyalty. The deeper structures of Iranian society, its land arrangements, its village hierarchies, its religious calendars proved stubbornly resistant to reorganization by distant kings in Antioch. The Susid Empire was simply too large to govern with any real coherence. Stretching from the Ayan coast to the borders of India, it demanded constant military attention on multiple frontiers simultaneously. The western provinces, with their lucrative trade and rescues Greek populations, inevitably absorbed more royal energy than the eastern reaches of the plateau. By the mid-33rd century BCE, this neglect was beginning to show. The eastern frontier grew porous. Royal governors in distant provinces accumulated local power and local loyalty, sometimes pursuing their own ambitions with minimal interference from the center. The mechanisms of control that had once held an empire together were loosening one thread at a time. In a region the Greeks called Partha in the northeastern stretches of the plateau, a nomadic Iranian people known as the Pan were watching and waiting for their moment to step into that widening gap. That moment came around 247 BCE, when a chieftain named Arcas led his Peen warriors into Partha and seized control of the region from its governor. The act was bold, almost reckless by conventional measure. Arcas had no grand palace, no treasury, no administrative apparatus to speak of. What he had was momentum, a loyal following, and the instinct to move when empires are distracted. He moved at exactly the right time. The Sukids were entangled in dynastic conflict and pressure from Toaik Egypt to the west. Arcas consolidated his hold on Partha, struck coins bearing his name, and established what would become one of antiquity's most enduring dynasties, the Arsacids. His successors would treat his name with such reverence that every subsequent Parthian king would be adopted as a royal title, blurring individual identity into something approaching myth. For nearly a century after Ares, the Parthian kingdom remained a regional power, cautious and consolidating, careful not to overreach. Then came Mithridates, ascending to the throne around 171 BCE. Mithridates possessed something rarer than military talent. He possessed patience paired with vision. He looked at the Seleucid Empire, still vast on the map, but hollow at its core, and understood that the time for patience was ending. His campaign swept westward and southward, with calculated aggression. Media fell. Then the extraordinary prize of Mesopotamia, with its ancient cities and incomprehensible wealth, came under Parthian control around 141 BCE, when Mithridates captured the Seleucid king Dmitry Ostafer in battle. The symbolic meaning was impossible to ignore. A nomadic Iranian dynasty had just humbled the inheritors of Alexander the Great. What made the Parthian Empire genuinely remarkable was not simply its military success, but the civilization it had constructed across its conquered territories. The Achaemenid were pragmatic rulers who understood that governing a mosaic of peoples required flexibility rather than uniformity. Greek remained in use on their coins and in certain official contexts, and Parthian nobles sometimes bore Greek names and collected Greek art with genuine enthusiasm. The famous written drinking vessels and bronze sculptures from this period reveal an aesthetic that feels comfortable in two cultural worlds simultaneously. Neither fully Greek nor fully Iranian, but something interestingly its own. The empire's underlying structure, however, was distinctly Iranian in character. The Achaemenids governed through a feudal arrangement of powerful noble houses, the great clans whose names appear repeatedly across Parthian records. Families like the Shuran and the Karen, who controlled vast estates and furnished the cavalry that formed the backbone of Parthian military power. These nobles owed loyalty to the king, but they were not subjects in any simple sense. They were partners in power, proud of lineages that predated Aradru, capable of making and unmaking kings when royal authority grew weak. This arrangement gave the empire resilience and flexibility, but also a persistent vulnerability. The same noble houses that could mobilize thousands of armored horsemen for a royal campaign could under different circumstances fragment the kingdom from within. Architecture and urban life flourished under Parthian patronage. The city of Ctesiphon on the Tigris grew into an imperial capital of considerable grandeur. The distinctive Parthian Iwan, a vaulted hall and at one end began appearing in palaces and public buildings, a form that would echo through Iranian architecture for centuries and eventually find its way into Islamic sacred spaces. By the mid-1st century BC, this hybrid empire stretched from the Euphrates to eastern Iran, and a new rival had appeared on the western horizon. The Romans were coming, and the collision between these two powers would reshape the ancient world. The Romans arrived with absolute confidence. In 53 BCE, Marcus Licinius Cassius, the wealthiest man in Rome and one-third of the ruling triumvirate, alongside Caesar and Pompey, led 7 legions eastward across the Euphrates. Roughly 40,000 soldiers, the finest infantry on earth, marching into Mesopotamia to add a Persian empire to Rome's growing list of conquests. Kra had bought his way to political prominence and now wanted military glory to match his peers. He would not find it. What he found instead was the Shirina. The commander of the Parthian forest bore the title of his noble house rather than a personal name in most Roman sources. Young, brilliant, and tactically audacious, the Shirina understood exactly what Roman legions could and could not do. They were devastating in close formation on flat terrain. They were vulnerable to cavalry that refused to engage directly. The Syrian desert between the Euphrates and the town of Caire offered perfect ground for what came next. The Persian cavalry arrived, not in a single mass charge, but in swirling, shifting waves. Roman infantry locked shields and waited for the momentum to exhaust itself, as it always had against every other enemy. But the Pantheon horse archers simply kept riding, kept losing, and crucially kept being resupplied. A camel train carrying thousands of arrows moved behind the Pantheon lines, and the Romans realized with dawning horror that the rain of arrows would not stop. When Roman soldiers broke formation to pursue, the famous Pantheon shot found them, arrows released backward, at full gallop with lethal accuracy. Craes died in the aftermath, killed during negotiations, his severed head reportedly delivered to the Pantheon court mid-performance of a Greek tragedy. Around 20,000 Roman soldiers died with him. Another 10,000 marched into captivity, disappearing into the Pantheon East. Legends would persist for centuries that some of these lost legionaries eventually settled in Central Asia. Their descendants encountered by Chinese chroniclers near the borders of Han territory. The evidence remains contested, but the story itself speaks to how completely the disaster haunted Rome's imagination. The captured Roman standards became a source of sustained humiliation. For decades, those eagle standards stood in Pantheon temples as monuments to Roman defeat until Augustus finally recovered them through diplomacy in 20 BCE, an event he celebrated with such theatrical enthusiasm that one might forget no battle had been fought. Mark Antony tried where Cossus had failed, launching a Pantheon campaign in 36 BCE that collapsed through poor planning and Pantheon harassment. He retreated, having lost roughly a quarter of his force, though unlike Cossus, he survived to be undone by other forces entirely. The wars that followed across the next 2 centuries settled into a grinding rhythm of raid, counter-raid, and negotiation along the Euphrates, with Armenia serving as a perpetual buffer state whose throne both empires disputed and occasionally seized. Neither power could deliver a killing blow against the other. Rome's legions dominated siege warfare and pitched battle on favorable ground. Sparta's feudal cavalry could evade, exhaust, and punish, but not hold territory permanently. The Emperor Trajan came closest to decisive Roman victory, sacking the Pantheon capital, Ctesiphon, in 116 CE, and briefly reaching the Persian Gulf. Standing at its shore, he reportedly lamented that he was too old to follow Alexander further east. Rome created new provinces from the conquest, but his successor, Hadrian, abandoned most of them within years. The Euphrates reasserted itself as the boundary between worlds, 2 empires, centuries of war, and the frontier barely moved. The exhaustion was real, and it was cumulative. Something would eventually have to give, though the breaking point would come not from Rome, but from within Iran itself. Something giving way from within Iran itself arrived in the spring of 224 CE on a plain near the river Hormuz in southwestern Persia. Ardasha, son of Papak and grandson of a Zoroastrian priest named Sassin, had spent years consolidating power in the ancient heartland of Fars, the same region where Cyrus and Darius had once ruled. The Pantheon system, with its loose confederation of semi-independent nobles, had always allowed ambitious provincial rulers room to maneuver. Ardasha maneuvered better than anyone before him. The last Pantheon king, Artabanes IV, understood the threat too late. At the Battle of Hormuzan, their forces met in a confrontation that would determine the next 4 centuries of Persian history. Artabanes died on the field. With him died the Arid dynasty after nearly 5 centuries of rule, and a new name entered history: the Sassanids. What Aduru built was something deliberately, consciously different from the Parthian world that preceded him. Where the Parthians had governed through feudal decentralization, the Sassanids, reaching back to the memory of the Achaemenids, restored the idea of a single divine Persian king. The title they chose was telling: Shahanshah, King of Kings. But now infused with sacred meaning, the king was not merely a ruler. He was the earthly representative of divine order itself. Religion became the architecture of this new state. Zoroastrianism, which had persisted through centuries of Macedonian and Parthian rule without official patronage, was now elevated into something altogether more formidable. A priestly class called the Magi, organized into a proper hierarchy under a chief priest, became partners in power alongside the monarchy. Sacred fires burned in temples across the empire, tended and maintained by state authority. Orthodoxy was defined, texts were compiled, and for the first time, Zoroastrianism had both institutional structure and royal backing. Yet, the most dramatic demonstration of Sassanid power came not from Adasia, but from his son, Shapur. The first inherited the throne, and immediately turned his ambitions westward toward Rome. 3 separate Roman emperors fell before him. But it was the third encounter that gave Shapur a moment unique in ancient history. In 260 CE, at the Battle of Edessa, Roman Emperor Valerian made the catastrophic decision to engage Shapur directly. The battle became a rout, and then a humiliation with number. Parallel Araning Roman Emperor captured alive on the battlefield. Shapur commemorated this moment with characteristic Persian grandeur at Nakshi Rostam, the ancient cliff face near Prospilus, where Achaemenid kings lay buried. His stonemasons carved an enormous relief into the rock. There stands Shapur on horseback, massive and triumphant. At his feet kneels a Roman emperor begging for mercy. Behind him, another stands in submission, grasping the royal bridle. The image broadcast across centuries what words alone could not sustain. Persia had humbled the greatest power in the Western world. These rock reliefs were not mere decoration. They were political proclamations carved in permanent form, speaking to any traveler who passed and to every future generation. But everyone within the empire shared the official Zoroastrian framework. The 3rd century also produced one of antiquity's most remarkable religious thinkers, a prophet named Mani, who worked together elements of Zoroastrianism, Christianity, and Buddhism into a new faith called Manism. It spread with extraordinary speed across the empire and beyond, troubling both Zoroastrian priests and later Roman authorities. The Sassanid court tolerated it uneasily, before eventually suppressing it. Religious vitality, military ambition, and centralized royal authority. These were the defining forces of the new Persia. But holding an empire together across such vast distances and ambitions would demand constant, exhausting vigilance. By the 4th century, the foundations were firmly laid. What came next was something rarer in the ancient world, an empire that did not merely conquer, but genuinely flourished. The reign of Khosrow, the first who ruled from 531 to 579 CE and earned the title Anushvan, meaning immortal Fat, represents the clearest expression of what Sassanid civilization could achieve at its height. He inherited an empire shaken by internal revolt and immediately set about rebuilding it from the inside. His administrative reforms were sweeping and systematic. The empire was divided into 4 great quadrants, each governed by a senior military commander, answerable directly to the king. A new land survey standardized taxation, replacing the old system of arbitrary assessment with fixed rates based on soil quality and crop type. Peasants and landowners alike now knew what they owed. This sounds bureaucratic, because it was, but in an empire stretching from the borders of Vancium to the edges of Central Asia, predictability and order were themselves revolutionary. Khosrow also reshaped Sassan society into a rigid hierarchy of 4 classes: priests, warriors, scribes, and commoners. Each had defined roles, privileges, and obligations. The system was inflexible and often harsh, but it gave the empire a coherent social grammar that would endure for generations. Yet, Khosrow's greatest legacy may not have been administrative at all. It may have been intellectual. The Academy of Gandhar, located in the southwestern province of Hust, became under his patronage the most important center of learning in the ancient world when the Byzantine emperor Justinian closed the philosophical schools of Athens in 529 CE. Many of those displaced scholars traveled east. Gandhar welcomed them. The academy brought together Greek physicians, Indian mathematicians, Syriac translators, and Persian astronomers under a single roof, creating a synthesis of knowledge without parallel. Medical techniques developed that would not reach Western Europe for centuries. The institution became the model for the great translation movements that would follow under the early Islamic caliphates. Sassanid culture extended far beyond the scholarly Persian craftsmen of this period produced textiles of breathtaking complexity. Woven silks depicting hunting scenes and mythological figures that were traded from China to Constantinople. Their metal work, silver, plates and bowls showing kings at the hunt set aesthetic standards imitated across the known world. When Islamic artisans of the 7th and 8th centuries searched for visual models, they reached instinctively for assassin forms. Persian courtly culture gave the world two enduring gifts in this period. The game of chess arrived from India and was transformed at the Sassanid court into the strategic game recognizable today. Polo, meanwhile, was already a Persian passion played with a ferocity that blurred the line between sport and military training. Both games traveled westward along trade routes, carrying Persian cultural prestige with them. But no golden age exists in isolation from conflict. Khosrow fought the Byzantines with the same energy he devoted domestic reform, contesting control of Mesopotamia, Syria, and the rich trade corridors of the Near Eastern campaigns that exhausted both empires. The wars were inconclusive but relentless, draining treasury and manpower on both sides. Across generations, his successors pressed these wars even harder. By the early 7th century, under Khosrow II, Sassanid armies achieved conquests that seemed to vindicate every claim of Persian greatness. Jerusalem fell. Egypt was taken. Byzantine armies were pushed back toward Constantinople itself. For one extraordinary decade, it appeared that Persia had finally definitively won the ancient contest with the West. It had not. The overreach was catastrophic, and the Byzantine counterattack that followed would leave both empires exhausted beyond recovery. Neither side recognized the true danger approaching from the south, from a desert peninsula that neither Rome nor Persia had ever considered worth serious attention. The armies gathering there would not merely defeat the Sassanids, they would transform Iran so completely that every dynasty examined so far, every king and empire and reform would be reframed through an entirely new lens. The world was about to change again, and this time, it would change forever. The signs of collapse came not gradually, but all at once. Two empires that had spent the better part of 4 decades bleeding each other, White had finally negotiated a weary peace in 628 CE. The Sassanid state that emerged from that peace was barely recognizable. In the 4 years following the fall of Khosrow, no fewer than 8 rulers claimed the Persian throne in rapid succession. Generals murdered kings. Court factions poisoned pretenders. The treasury was depleted, the army fragmented, and the magnificent bureaucratic machinery that Khosrow had built with such patient care was grinding toward paralysis. Into this vacuum came something the ancient world had never seen before. The Arab tribes of the Arabian Peninsula had always been to Persian eyes a peripheral nuisance raiding the frontier and retreating into their deserts. But between 632 and 636 CE, those tribes had been bound together by something more powerful than any king's command. The faith of Islam revealed through the Prophet Muhammad and carried forward by his successors, the caliphs, gave the Arab armies a unity and a purpose that no military reorganization alone could have created. These were men who believed absolutely in what they were fighting for. The decisive confrontation came in the autumn of 636 CE at a place along the Euphrates River called Al-Qadisa. For 3 days, perhaps 4, the Sassanid forces under the general Rostam Farrakad held against the Arab advance. The Persian war elephants terrified the Arab horses. Initially, the Sassanid infantry fought with the disciplined ferocity of soldiers from a proud tradition. But on the final day, a sandstorm blew across the battlefield, blinding the Persian lines. Rostam was killed. His forces broke. The road to Kasfon, the imperial capital, lay open. When the Arab armies entered Kassan weeks later, what they found astonished even them. The treasury contained riches that the soldiers of the desert could scarcely comprehend. Silks, jewels, gold plate, the accumulated wealth of centuries. The great Sassanid throne hall, the Takasra, with its famous arched vault soaring nearly 40 millimeters overhead, stood as a monument to everything Persia had built. It stands in ruins still today on the outskirts of modern Baghdad, the only surviving piece of ancient Kazapon, a solitary reminder of an empire that once commanded the world. Yet Persia was not finished in a single battle. The young assassinated King Yazdega III retreated eastward, rallying what forces he could, calling on local governors and generals to hold the line. For 6 more years, he moved from province to province, a king without a capital, trying to reconstitute an empire that was dissolving around him. The final military reckoning came at Navand, deep in the Iranian plateau in 642 CE. The Sassanid forces gathered there represented the last serious concentration of imperial power. The Arabs called their victory at Mihavan the victory of victories, and the name was not an exaggeration. After Nevand, organized Sassanid resistance effectively ceased. Persian armies did not disappear overnight, but no force large enough to reverse the conquest would ever assemble again. Yazda III spent the remaining years of his life as a fugitive in his own empire, drifting eastward toward the borders of Central Asia, always seeking shelter, always one step ahead of both the Arab advance and the treachery of Persian lords who calculated their own survival. In 651 CE, near the City of Envy, he was murdered not by an Arab soldier, but by a local miller for his remaining possessions. The last of the assassinated line died in obscurity. Abandoned by the empire, he was born to rule. 4 centuries of Persian kingship ended not with a final battle, but with a body by a riverbank in the eastern dust. What followed was not simply a change of rulers. It was a transformation so total that the very way Iranians understood themselves, their language, their faith, their relationship to God and king. What does it mean to conquer a civilization that refuses to disappear? The Arab armies that swept across the Iranian plateau in the 600s brought with them not just a new political order, but a new faith. And the question of how that faith would take root in Persian soil would shape the next 14 centuries of history. The answer, it turned out, was slowly, unevenly, and on terms that Persia itself would help to define. The early Umayyad Caliphate, established in Damascus in 661 CE, administered its vast empire through a system that drew a sharp distinction between Arab Muslims and everyone else. Non-Muslims, including the millions of Zoroastrians across Iran, were permitted to practice their faith in exchange for a tax called the jizya. The arrangement carried a message beneath its legal surface. Conversion brought not just spiritual belonging, but relief from financial burden and, crucially, access to the privileges of the conquering class. Yet the Umayyad approach to those privileges exposed a deep contradiction. Arab identity and Islamic identity were increasingly treated as the same thing. Iranian converts to Islam known as Molli or clients found themselves Muslim in faith, but still subordinate in status, excluded from senior administrative posts, paid less than Arab soldiers in the same armies, reminded at every turn that the empire they now served considered them second as believers. The resentment this generated was not a quiet grievance. It was fuel. Through all of this, Persian identity did not dissolve. It went underground, and it endured. The Persian language diary continued to be spoken in homes, in markets, in the courts of local administrators who had bent the knee to the caliphate without surrendering their culture. Nor the ancient spring festival, rooted in the Zoroastrian calendar, continued to be celebrated with fires and feasts across the Iranian countryside, a rhythm of the year that no foreign conquest had yet managed to interrupt. Zoroastrian priests preserved sacred texts. Persian poets kept their language alive in forms that would eventually produce some of the greatest literature the medieval world would ever know. By the early 70s, the tensions within the Umayyad Caliphate had reached a breaking point. A revolutionary movement began to crystallize in the eastern provinces in Khorasan, the great Iranian region stretching across what is today northeastern Iran and Central Asia. It drew together Arab settlers, Iranian Molli converts, and communities who had never accepted Umayyad legitimacy. The movement organized under the black banners of the Abbasid family, descendants of the Prophet's uncle, and it carried a message of Islamic equality that resonated precisely because so many people had been denied it. The Abbasid revolution of 750 CE was, in the most direct sense, an Iranian revolution wearing Islamic clothing. The general who led the decisive military campaign was Abu Muslim, almost certainly of Iranian origin, commanding armies drawn heavily from Khorasan's Iranian Muslim population. When the last Umayyad Caliph Mon II was defeated and killed, the world's most powerful empire changed hands and Iranians had made it happen. The Abbasids moved their capital eastward to the newly founded city of Baghdad, deep within the cultural orbit of ancient Mesopotamia and Persia. Iranian administrators, scholars, and courtiers poured into the new capital. The Persian bureaucratic tradition, the very tradition that had run empires for centuries, began reasserting itself at the center of Islamic civilization. Persia had been conquered, it had converted, and now, quietly and with extraordinary patience, it had begun to reconquer from within. The stage was set for a Persian renaissance, one that would carry the language, the poetry, and the memory of Cyrus's heirs into a new and brilliant age. The reconquest from within did not happen in a single dramatic moment. It unfolded over generations in the courts of regional governors who gradually remembered what their ancestors had built. By the late 80s, the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad was growing hollow at its core. Real power had drifted to Turkish military commanders and ambitious provincial dynasties on the periphery. In Khorasan and Transaxana, the land stretching from northeastern Iran into Central Asia, a Persian family called the Achaemenids had risen to govern in the caliph's name. In practice, they governed for themselves, and they did so in a language their Arab overlords barely recognized. The cemented court at Piqara became something remarkable, a laboratory for the rebirth of Persian as a literary language. For nearly 2 centuries, Arabic had dominated the written world of Islam, the language of the Quran, of law, of science. Persian had survived in spoken form, but had retreated from the page. The Achaemenids changed that. They patronized poets who wrote in a refined Mu-Persian, the same language their subjects actually spoke, and they filled their treasury with enough silver from Khorasan's mines to make literary patronage not just possible but lavish. From this court emerged a figure whose work would define Iranian identity for 1,000 years. Abu al-Qasim Ferdowsi, born around 930 CE in the Khorasan region, spent the better part of 30 years composing Shana, the Book of Kings, 60,000 versus the mythic history of Iran, from the dawn of creation to the Arab conquest, a vast tapestry of heroes, monsters, doomed kings, and tragic loves when the Achaemenid dynasty fell to Turkish invaders. Before Ferdowsi could secure his promised reward, he reportedly revised the poem's dedication in bitterness. No matter, the sham survived every dynasty that followed, preserving the memory of Rastam and Sorb, of Zal and Samorg, in a Persian so pure that schoolchildren can still read it today. While Ferdowsi was writing mythology, his contemporaries were transforming the actual structure of human knowledge. Ibn Sina, known in the West as a Basha born in 980 CE had memorized the Quran by age 10 and mastered Greek philosophy and medicine not long after. His canon of medicine remained a standard medical textbook in European universities until the 1600s. His philosophical works pushed Aristotelian logic into new territory that would unsettle thinkers from Paris to Baghdad for centuries. Alongside him worked al-Biruni, perhaps the most quietly astonishing scholar of the medieval world. Born in 973 CE in what is today Uzbekistan, al-Biruni calculated the circumference of the earth with startling accuracy, wrote pioneering studies of Indian civilization, and produced work on mathematics, astronomy, and ethnography that feels almost modern in its empirical discipline. To the west, another Persian dynasty was making a different kind of statement. The Birds, a Shia Muslim family from the Caspian highlands, marched into Baghdad in 1945 CE and placed the Sunni Caliph under their protection, a polite arrangement that left the Caliph as a ceremonial figurehead while the Berdis held actual power. For the first time since the 7th century, Shia Muslims governed at the center of the Islamic world. Persian administrative culture, Persian ceremonial titles, Persian aesthetic sensibility, all of it flooded back into the heart of the caliphate. Persian had become something extraordinary, not merely a language of one people, but the shared literary and cultural tongue of an entire civilization stretching from Istanbul to Delhi. Yet the forces gathering on the steppe cared nothing for poetry or philosophy. The Turkish world was moving, and Iran stood in its path. They came from the steppes of Central Asia. These Turkish warriors riding hard and fast across the grasslands, with little regard for the civilizations that had preceded them. And yet something remarkable happened when they arrived. Iran did not fall silent. It converted its conquerors. Mahmud of Ghazni, Sultan from 998 to 1030 CE, built the first great Turkish empire centered on the Afghan city of Ghazni. He raided northern India 17 times, stripping temples of their treasures and earning a fearsome reputation across the subcontinent. Yet back at his court, he kept Persian poets and scholars in extraordinary comfort. He famously promised Fozi a gold coin for every verse of the Shawnin, though that payment, as history records, never fully arrived. The contradiction defined the Ghaznavids entirely, conquerors who, desperately wanted to be remembered as cultivated Persian kings. That contradiction was settled permanently at the Battle of Dandakan in 1040 CE. A Turkish confederation known as the Seljuks met the Ghaznavid army in the deserts of Kusan and destroyed it utterly. Within a decade, the Seljuks controlled Persia, Iraq, and Anatolia, eventually becoming the dominant power in the entire Islamic world. What did these new masters do with their conquest? They hired Persian administrators and let them run everything. The greatest of these was Nissim Mal, a Persian bureaucrat from Khorasan, who served as vizier to two successive Seljuk sultans for over 30 years. His treatise on governance, the Sayas at Nama, written in elegant Persian prose, codified an entire model of statecraft, how kings should hear complaints, how spies should operate, how courts should function. It was essentially a Persian instruction manual handed to a Turkish dynasty, and they followed it faithfully. Nizmal also established the Ny Samia Madrasa system, universities stretching from Baghdad to Nishapur that shaped Islamic scholarship for generations. While administrators governed poets soared, Omar, mathematician and astronomer from Nishapur, calculated the solar year with greater accuracy, precision than the Julian calendar, and simultaneously wrote the Rubaiyat quatrains of wine, roses, and philosophical resignation that would eventually reach Victorian England and astonish an entirely different civilization. Sufi mystical poetry deepened alongside him. Spiritual writers reaching toward divine union through verse that blurred the line between sacred and intoxicating beauty. But empires built fast can fracture faster. After the great Seljuk Sultan Malik Shah died in 1092 CE, his sons fought each other across a generation of civil wars. The empire split into competing branches, and from the eastern margins rose a new power. The Khwarezmian Empire centered on the region south of the Aros Sea, ambitious and hungry. Persian culture had survived two Turkish conquests by absorbing its conquerors from within. Whether it could survive what was coming next from the east was an entirely different question. What came next from the east was not conquest in any familiar sense. It was a razor. In 1218 CE, the Khwarezmian Shah Muhammad II made a decision that would doom his empire and devastate an entire civilization. When a Mongol trade caravan arrived at the border city of Otta, the local governor, suspecting espionage, had its merchants executed. Genghis Khan sent ambassadors demanding justice. Muhammad had them killed too. It was, historians agree, one of the most catastrophic miscalculations in recorded history. The Mongol response arrived in 1219 CE with a force estimated between 100,000 and 200,000 warriors, organized with a military precision no army of that era could match. Muhammad's empire, vast but whole low, crumbled within months. And then the killing began in earnest. MV, the ancient Silk road city in present-day Turkmenistan, once home to over 500,000 souls, fell in 1221 CE. Contemporary accounts, admittedly prone to exaggeration, describe Mongol soldiers dividing the survivors among themselves for systematic slaughter over days. The Persian historian too, who lived through this era, wrote that he wished he had not been born to witness it. Modern estimates suggest MV lost the vast majority of its population. Misapur followed. The city, where Omar Khayyam had once calculated the movements of stars, was razed so completely that Mongol forces reportedly stacked human skulls in pyramids, separated by gender. Harad surrendered, then revolted, then was destroyed a second time with even greater ferocity. City after city across Khorasan, the cultural heartland of Persian civilization, ceased to exist in any meaningful sense, but the destruction went deeper than bodies and buildings. Iran's agricultural civilization rested on an extraordinary network of underground irrigation channels called kennets, some of them centuries old, engineering marvels that carried water from mountain aquifers across desert plains. Mongol armies, either deliberately or through sheer indifference, destroyed these systems wholesale. Fields that had fed millions returned to desert. The ecological damage outlasted the violence by generations. The demographic numbers are staggering and contested, but scholars estimate that Iran's population may have fallen from somewhere between 10 and 15 million people before the invasions to perhaps one-third of that figure within decades. Entire regions that had been densely settled and agriculturally productive remained sparsely inhabited for 2 centuries afterward. This was not merely a political catastrophe, it was a civilizational wound of extraordinary depth. And yet, with the grim irony, the Mongols did what conquerors before them had always done in Iran. They stayed, and Iran worked on them. Holion, grandson of Genghis, established the Mongol Ilkhanate across Persia following his westward campaigns in the 1250s CE. His conquest of Baghdad in 1258 CE destroyed the Abbasid Caliphate entirely, an event that sent shock waves across the Islamic world. But Hulig's wife was a Christian. His court was cosmopolitan, and Persian administrators once again found their way into positions of genuine influence. By the time of Hulig's successes, Mongol Ilkhans were converting to Islam and patronizing Persianizing Persia with considerable enthusiasm. Recovery was slow, painful, and uneven. But the Persian capacity to outlast catastrophe, to absorb even the most destructive of conquerors and reshape them from within, had not been extinguished. It had merely been tested at a scale no previous century had imagined. A new synthesis was emerging from the ruins, and with it, one of the most brilliant cultural flowerings in Iranian history was quietly taking shape. The transformation the previous chapter promised came most dramatically through a single ruler. In 1295 CE, Ghazan Khan ascended to the Ilkhanid throne and made a declaration that permanently altered Persia's political landscape. He converted to Islam not as a diplomatic gesture, but as a genuine reorientation of his entire administration. Persian became the language of governance. Mongol tribal customs gave way to Islamic law. Taxes were rationalized. Irrigation networks slowly repaired, and the agricultural heartland of Khorasan began, tentatively, to breathe again. Ghazan's most enduring legacy arrived through his extraordinary vizier. Rashid Olden, a physician-turned-statesman-turned-historian, Rashid Olden assembled teams of scholars from across the known world to produce the Compendium of Chronicles, the first truly universal history ever written, spanning civilizations from China to Western Europe. It was an achievement of staggering ambition, and it was written in Persian. The language of Ferdowsi had become once again the language of world historical thought. Then Timur arrived, born near Samarkand in 1336 CE. Timur the Lame, called Tamerlane by the Europeans, who feared him from a distance, was a Turkish Mongol warlord of ferocious military genius and equally ferocious cruelty. His campaigns into Iran beginning in the 1380 CE were not conquest in any administrative sense. They were punishment applied at an industrial scale. Isfahan surrendered in 1387 CE, then rose in revolt. Timur's response was to order the construction of towers built from the skulls of its citizens, with estimates ranging from 70,000 to 200,000 dead. Baghdad, Shiraz, and dozens of lesser cities endured similar fates. What Ghazan Khan's reforms had patiently rebuilt across a century. Timber unmade in seasons, and yet with the dark rhythm that defined so much of Iranian history, catastrophe again preceded flowering. Timur himself loved art and dragged craftsmen and architects back to his capital at Samarkand rather than simply killing them. After his death in 1405 CE, his son Shahuk moved the Timurid capital to Herat in eastern Khorasan and inaugurated one of the most refined cultural periods in Persian history. The court at Hat became a magnet for poets, painters, calligraphers, and philosophers. Shah Rukh's son, the astronomer Prince Olberg, built an observatory at Samarkand and calculated the length of the solar year to within minutes of modern precision using 15th-century instruments and pure observational genius. It was painting, however, that achieved perhaps the highest expression. The Herod school of miniature painting, working under the master Kamalad in Bizard, produced woe racks of extraordinary delicacy. Every tiny figure alive with personality, every garden and palace rendered in Jew-like detail. Persian poetry found new champions, and the libraries of Timurid princes became legendary. Brilliance and violence had braided themselves together across 2 centuries into something distinctly, unmistakably Persian. The next transformation would emerge from a different kind of fire, entirely out of the ashes of Timurid splendor. Something wholly unexpected rose, not a foreign conqueror arriving from the steppes, not a dynasty carried in on horseback from Central Asia, but a movement born from within Iran itself, from the mystical Sufi brotherhoods that had quietly sustained Persian spiritual life for centuries. The Savior Order had its origins in the city of Ardil in northwestern Iran. Founded by a revered Sufi master named Safi-ul-Din in the early 14th century for generations, it remained a peaceful religious brotherhood, drawing followers through spiritual teaching rather than military ambition. Then gradually something hardened inside it, political instability. The trauma of timid violence and the ambitions of successive leaders transformed this contemplative order into something closer to a revolutionary army. Its followers fanatically devoted, wore distinctive red headgear with 12 folds, honoring the 12 imams of Shia tradition. History would call them the Qizilbash, the Redheads. In 1487 CE, a child named Ismail was born into this movement's leadership. He was precocious, magnetic, and possessed of an almost terrifying certainty about his divine purpose. By the time he was 12 years old, he was already leading his followers through hiding and exile, hunted by rival Turkmen powers. By the time he was 14, he was commanding armies. In 1501 CE, the 14-year-old Ismail captured Tris, the ancient city that had served as a Mongol capital, and they declared himself Shah of Iran. The Safavidid dynasty had begun, but the political declaration was almost secondary to the religious one that followed. Immediately, Ismail proclaimed 12 Shia Islam, the official state religion of Iran, and ordered his entire population to convert. This was not a gentle invitation. Sunni scholars who refused were executed. Shia rituals became compulsory. Cursing the first 3 Sunni caliphs was mandated from pulpits throughout the land. In a territory where the majority had been Sunni Muslim for centuries, this enforced transformation was carried out with the absolute conviction of a man who believed himself quite literally to be a divine figure. The consequences rippled outward immediately to Iran's west. The Ottoman Empire, the most powerful Sunni state on earth, recognized an existential rival. The collision came at the Battle of Calderon in 1514 CE. Ottoman Sultan Selim, the first commanding an army equipped with gunpowder artillery and disciplined infantry, crushed Ismail's cavalry-based forces. The Qizilbash warriors who believed their devotion made them invincible discovered that faith provided no protection against cannon fire. Isma never recovered psychologically from the defeat. He withdrew, drank heavily, and never commanded another major campaign. But the state he had created proved more durable than the man himself. Calderon established an Ottoman Safavidid frontier that would define the border between the Sunni and Shia worlds for centuries, a line whose echoes can still be traced in modern maps of the Middle East. What Israel truly created more than any dynasty or border was a specifically Iranian religious identity, by making 12 Shia Islam the defining characteristic of Iranian civilization. He separated Iran permanently from its Arab and Turkish Sunni neighbors and forged a sense of distinctiveness that would survive every subsequent conquest and upheaval. The Shia clergy, empowered and institutionalized, became permanent participants in Iranian political life. The full flowering of this new state, its arts, its administration, its architecture, and its extraordinary ambition would await a ruler of even greater genius. The foundations, however, had been permanently laid when Shabasi came to power in 1588 CEE. He inherited a state under siege, as a Suzap raid pressed from the northeast. The Ottomans held vast territories to the west, and the Qizilbash tribal commanders, who had once built Safavidid power, now threatened to devour it from within. What he did next would transform Iran into one of the most sophisticated empires on earth. His first instinct was ruthlessly practical, recognizing that the tribal cavalry, loyal to their own chiefs, was more a liability than an asset. Abbas dismantled the old military structure and built something entirely new. Drawing on the model of the Ottoman Janissaries, he created regiments of trained slave soldiers, young Georgian, Armenian, and Saracen men, absorbed into royal service, loyal exclusively to the Shah rather than to any tribal master. Equipped with muskets and artillery, this modernized army gave Abbas the instrument he needed. The reconquests came swiftly. He first made a humiliating but calculated peace with the Ottomans, trading territory for time, then turned east to smash the US Uzbek forces, threatening Khorasan. By 607 CE, he had reversed the Ottoman concessions entirely, recapturing Tris, Baghdad, and vast stretches of Mesopotamia in a sequence of campaigns that announced Safavid Iran as a military power demanding serious respect. But Abbas was not merely a general, he was a builder of civilizations. In 1698 CE, he moved his capital to Isfahan, a city of roughly 500,000 inhabitants, nestled on the central Iranian plateau, and proceeded to remake it into one of the most beautiful urban spaces the world had ever seen. Persian architects working under his patronage constructed the Noxi Jan Square, an immense public space more than 500 meters long, ringed by 2-story arcades sheltering thousands of shops. At its southern end rose the Shiklot Fala Mosque, its tiled dome shifting between cream and rose, depending on the angle of light. Dominating the square's southern axis stood the Great Shah Mosque, its entrance portal soaring nearly 30 meters high, covered in turquoise and cobalt tile work of extraordinary intricacy. Persians simply called Isfahan Nespan, half the world. The boast was not entirely immodest. The bazaars connecting the square to the older city became arteries of global commerce. Safavid carpets, their geometric and floral patterns, achieving a technical and artistic refinement never surpassed before or since, flowed outward to European courts and Ottoman palaces. Persian miniature painting, silk weaving, and metal work reached peaks of accomplishment that left visiting European diplomats struggling for adequate descriptions. Those diplomats arrived in considerable numbers. Abbas actively courted European powers as strategic counterweights against the Ottomans, dispatching embassies to Spain, England, and the courts of Italy. The partnership produced concrete results in 1622 CE with English naval assistance from the East India Company. Abbas expelled the Portuguese from their fortified trading post at Hormuz, reasserting Aramean control over the critical entrance to the Persian Gulf and reshaping regional trade routes in Safavidide favor. The century following Abbas would slowly erode what he had built. Weaker successes proved unable to maintain either military discipline or the extraordinary administrative energy he had sustained across a 42-year reign. By 1722 CE, Afghan invaders from the east willed Old March nearly unopposed into Isfahan itself, ending Safavid rule. Yet the Isfahan Abbas created endured. Its mosques still stand. Its square still draws millions of visitors annually. What he built in stone and tile outlasted every conqueror who followed, which brings us to the question of what rose from those ruins next. The Afghan tribesmen who poured through Isfahan's gates in 1722 came not as a sophisticated conquering civilization, but as opportunists, seizing a rotting prize. The Jilai Afghans under Mahmud Hutaki had besieged the great city for months, starving its population into submission. The last Safavid Shah Sultan Hussein surrendered his crown in person. What followed was 7 years of brutal occupation that shattered the social fabric Abbas had so carefully constructed. Population estimates for Isfahan collapsed from perhaps 500,000 to barely 100,000 within a generation. Yet chaos in Iranian history has a habit of producing remarkable men. Nato Kohai, born somewhere around 1688 into a modest family in the northeastern province of Khorasan, understood power the way a craftsman understands his tools. Rising through tribal warfare and military service, he gradually positioned himself as the indispensable military force capable of driving the Afghans out. By 1729, he had done exactly that, shattering the Gil's AI forces and restoring a nominal Safavidide to the throne. But everyone understood who truly held Iran in his fist. In 1736, NATO dropped the pretense entirely and crowned himself Shah. His ambitions, however, extended far beyond Iranian borders. The invasion of India stands as one of history's most spectacular military adventures. The Mongol Empire, once a colossus stretching across the subcontinent, had decayed almost as completely as the Safavids. In 1739, NATO crossed the Indus, crushed a vastly larger Mughal force at the Battle of Karnal and Nti. Red Delhi, what he extracted from that city, staggers the imagination. The peacock throne constructed for the Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan at a cost equivalent to twice the price of the Taj Mahal was carried back to Iran. So was the Kohinoor diamond, a stone whose subsequent journey through Afghan Sikh and finally British hands would make it one of history's most contested objects. The loot from Delhi was so vast that NATO abolished taxation across Iran for 3 years. But brilliance and cruelty traveled together in Natasha. His later years darkened into paranoia and savage repression. In 1747, his own officers murdered him in his tent, and Iran fractured once more. The decades following produced competing warlords and dynasties fighting over the Iranian hotland. From this struggle emerged 2 principal contenders. Karim Khonzand, ruling from Shiraz in the south, proved a genuinely unusual figure in this brutal era. A leader who preferred the modest title of Aquel, regent of the people over imperial grandeur. His reign brought relative peace and modest prosperity to southern Iran. But his Zand dynasty would not survive him for long. Pressing from the north and east, a Turkish tribal confederation called the Qajars waited patiently for their moment. That moment was coming, and with it an entirely new chapter in Iran's ancient story. The man who united Iran under Qajar rule was not a figure history remembers fondly. Agam Muhammad Khan, the dynasty's ferocious founder, had been castrated as a boy by political enemies, and whatever cruelty the world had shown him, he returned with interest. By 1796, he had crushed the last Zan pretender and seized control of the Iranian plateau, choosing Thrawn, then little more than a provincial town, as his new capital. He was assassinated the following year before he could consolidate his empire further. But the dynasty he built would endure for over a century. The Qajar Shah who followed were a different breed from the warrior who founded their line. They were courtmen, comfortable with ceremony, fond of pleasure, and dangerously unprepared for the new world pressing in on Iran's borders. That world arrived in the form of two empires whose appetite seemed without limit. Russia was expanding southward with relentless momentum, absorbing the Caucasian kingdoms that had long existed within Iran's sphere of influence. Two catastrophic wars settled the question permanently. The Treaty of Galestan in 1813 stripped Iran of territories including modern Georgia and parts of Azerbaijan. The Treaty of Turkmen in 1828 cut even deeper, surrendering additional Caucasian lands and forcing Iran to pay a ruinous indemnity of 5 million silver rubles. Perhaps worse than the territory lost were the capitulation clauses, legal provisions granting Russian citizens special protections inside Iran that Iranian courts could not touch. Sovereignty was becoming a polite fiction. Britain watched from the south with equal calculation. London's obsession was not Iran itself, but India, the crown jewel of British imperial ambition. Iran was a buffer, a corridor, a potential invasion route that had to be managed, pressured, and kept dependent. The two empires competed across Iranian soil in what historians would call the Great Game, a phrase that sanitizes with sporting language what was in practice a systematic dismemberment of Iranian independence. Into this grinding pressure stepped Mir Alan Shah, who ruled for nearly half a century, beginning in 1848. He was not without curiosity or intelligence. He traveled to Europe 3 times, marveling at railways and telegraphs, and attempted to introduce some of these wonders to Iran. A telegraph line connected Tehran to the wider world. Military mission opened. A newspaper began publication. Yet modernization without structural reform was decoration on a rotting wall. To fund his court and his ambitions, Nalin Shah sold Iran piece by piece. Concessions granted to British and Russian interests handed control of banking, roads, fisheries, and extraction rights to foreign companies. The most catastrophic of these was the tobacco concession of 1890, which gave a British firm monopoly control over the entire production and sale of Iranian tobacco. The Iranian response was extraordinary. In 1891, one of the country's senior religious scholars issued a ruling declaring tobacco use forbidden so long as foreign control persisted. In a society where tobacco was woven into daily life, the effect was immediate and electric. Iranians put down their pipes across the country. Even the women of the royal harem reportedly refused to smoke. The Shah had no choice but to cancel the concession, though the financial penalties cost Iran dearly. It was the first mass political movement in modern Iranian history, a preview of something larger gathering beneath the surface. Nero-Den Shah never grasped what the tobacco protest truly signaled. In 1896, on the eve of celebrations marking 50 years of his reign, he was shot dead by an assassin. The old order was cracking, and the Iranian people were beginning to imagine something their rulers had never offered them. A voice in their own fate, the voice the Iranian people imagined, did not remain silent for long. By 1905, a coalition of merchants, intellectuals, and religious scholars had found common cause in their fury at Kajami's rule and foreign domination. Street protests, strikes, and the traditional practice of Bas taking sanctuary in a sacred space to demand justice paralyzed Tehran. The movement was remarkable in its breadth. Clerics who had never sat beside secular reformers found themselves united by a single demand: a constitution, a parliament, a law that bound even the Shah himself. Mozaffar Alan Shah, weakened and ailing, conceded. In 1906, Iran became one of the first countries in Asia to establish a constitutional monarchy. A parliament called the Mojlis convened in Thran, and for a brief extraordinary moment, ordinary Iranians held genuine political power. The moment did not last. The new Shah Muhammad Ali despised the constitution and in 1908 used Russian-trained Cossack troops to bombard the parliament building into rubble. A civil war followed. Constitutionalists fought back from Tiz and elsewhere, eventually restoring the constitution in 1990. Yet the victory was hollow. In 1907, Britain and Russia had quietly signed the Anglo-Russian Convention, formally dividing Iran into spheres of influence, a Russian zone in the north, a British zone in the south, and a nominally neutral belt between them. Iran was not consulted. The First World War completed Iran's humiliation. Though Tehran declared neutrality, the country became a battleground for Russian, British, and Ottoman forces. Famine swept through large parts of the country. Perhaps 2 million Iranians died from starvation and disease, a catastrophe largely forgotten by the outside world. Out of this devastation came a soldier named Raza Khan. In February of 1921, commanding the Kesak Brigade, he marched on Thran and seized power in a swift coup. He was practical, ruthless, and possessed of an iron will to restore Iranian sovereignty and order. Within 4 years, he had outmaneuvered every rival. In 1925, the last Kajasha was formally deposed and Rakan crowned himself, founding the Pahlavi dynasty. As Russia, he pursued modernization with the force of a military campaign. A transcontinental railway stretching nearly 900 miles was completed by 1938. Secular courts replaced religious ones. Universities opened. The veil was forcibly banned for women in 1936, a reform imposed without consent. As officers tore headscarves from women in the streets, he also broke Iran's economic dependence piece by piece, renegotiating the British oil concession and building a modern state bureaucracy. But Reza Shah's authoritarianism made him vulnerable. When the Second World War engulfed the region and Britain, and the Soviet Union grew suspicious of his overtures to Germany, they simply invaded Iran in August of 1941 and forced him to abdicate. His son, Mohammad Raza, would inherit a throne already trembling beneath him. The young Shah who inherited that trembling throne in 1941 was just 21 years old, slight and uncertain, surrounded by a country that had been occupied, humiliated, and was now seething with political energy long suppressed by his father. Into that opening stepped Mohammad Most, a French-educated lawyer from an aristocratic family. Mossadegh had spent decades in opposition, insisting that Iranian sovereignty meant nothing as long as British Petroleum, operating under the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, extracted the country's greatest resource while returning a fraction of its value to Iranians. The numbers were stark. Britain collected more in taxes from the company than Iran received in royalties. The oil beneath Persian soil was financing British power while Iranians lived in poverty. In April of 1951, the Mughals voted to nationalize the oil industry. Moes became prime minister. Crowds filled the streets of Thrawn in celebration. For the first time in living memory, Iran would control its own wealth. The British response was swift and merciless. A naval blockade stopped Iranian oil from reaching world markets. Diplomats and technicians withdrew. The economy began to suffocate. Washington watched uneasily. The Truman administration had initial sympathy for Most's democratic credentials. The Eisenhower administration that followed did not. By 1953, the Cold War calculus had hardened. A weakened, unstable Iran on the Soviet border was in American eyes a communist invitation. The CIA and British intelligence services conceived Operation Ajax in August of 1953. Paid mobs stormed through Tehran. Military officers loyal to the Shah moved against Most's government. Within days, it was over. Moes was arrested, tried, and spent the rest of his life under house arrest. The Shah returned from brief exile, now indebted to foreign powers in ways that would define and ultimately destroy his reign. What followed were decades of paradox. The Shah pursued genuine modernization through his White Revolution. Beginning in 1963, redistributing land, expanding education, granting women the right to vote. Industrialization transformed Iranian cities. Oil revenues, especially after the price shocks of the 1970s, poured money into infrastructure and a swelling middle class. Yet alongside every school built, every new highway paved, the secret police known as Savok tightened its grip. Tens of thousands were imprisoned. Torture was systematic. Political parties were abolished. Iran grew richer and more repressive simultaneously. A combination that breeds not gratitude, but fury, and the fury found a voice. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini had been exiled in 1964 for denouncing the Shah's reforms as surrenders to foreign influence from Iraq and then from a suburb of Paris. He sent cassette tapes into Iran, his sermons duplicated by the thousands and passed hand to hand through mosques and bazaars. The medium was ancient, the message was electric. By late 1978, millions were in the streets. Bashir's army, vast and American-equipped, hesitated to massacre the crowds it faced. The institutions of modernization he had built, the universities, the urban professional classes had produced people with expectations his G-Oven could not satisfy, and patience it had exhausted. On February 1, 1979, Achaemenid's Air France flight landed at Mayabad Airport in Tran. The crowd that met him numbered in the millions. Within days, the monarchy that Cyrus the Great had first defined 25 centuries earlier was finished. Iran would now become something the ancient world could never have imagined. An Islamic republic, a theocracy born from revolution, shaped by grievance, and destined to reshape the Middle East and the modern world for generations to come. 25 centuries of empire, invasion, and reinvention reveal a civilization that has never stopped defying extinction. Subscribe for more histories the world has forgotten to.